They'd rather you be inscrutable than difficult. They'd rather you be impassive than original. They'd rather you be enlightened than ambiguous. They'd rather you be opaque than unpredictable. They'd rather you be immaculate than ambitious. They'd rather you be serene than volatile. They'd rather you be deathless than carnal. They'd rather you be beautiful than vital.
That reading is from a poem called 18, Palpable. It's from a new book called 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem. It's a slim volume, but one that packs a significant punch in its consideration of identity and culture, of writerly forms and language in all its tenderness and violence. Palpable, in case you had to Google it, I did, means related to the eyelids. It's a word choice and a poem that is typical of this fierce, deliberate, deeply considered collection. But let's face it, however good a book of poetry is, I think it's fair to say that such a publication is rarely a major literary event. For the most part, poetry tends to be treated like a niche pursuit, rather than something of wider, even mainstream interest. But this book is different. This book is the long-awaited new book by Melbourne writer Nam Le. For once, poetry is an event. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, a show about the books we love and the stories behind them. There's a tendency to overhype promising debuts. It's not surprising, the shock of the new. Big talent announcing itself, suggesting that there's this entire career of books ahead for the eager reader, that we're there for the start of something big. But it's pretty rare for that hype to be more or less universal, and even rarer for it to be deserved. Nam Le deserved the hype. His debut book of short stories came out in 2008. It was called The Boat and, for lack of a more delicate way of putting it, reviewers and readers alike lost their shit over it. He scooped up awards and praise around the world. Noted harsh marker at the New York Times, Michiko Kakutani, referred to the first story in the collection as a singular masterpiece. A stratospheric success by any measure. And since then, Nam has taken his time. In the intervening years, he read, he lived a life. He wrote an essay on David Malouf, the odd poem for the monthly, and he considered his next move deeply. Now, 16 years later, Nam has produced his follow-up. In your Writers on Writers book about David Malouf, you talk about the fact that part of your affinity with him is the fact that he was first and foremost a poet. And you describe yourself in the same terms, that it was poetry first for you. Why do you write poetry? Why are you drawn to it?
I think in that book, the metaphor I used was poetry is the weather. You know, it's just the way things are, and it's inescapable, and it's beautiful, and it's, you know, it's terrible and horrible, and clement and all those things. Like it's how I started being enthralled by words and by language, I guess. And I still remember being struck by certain rhythms of poems when I was young, and shocked at how shockingly visceral that felt, and how deeply it sort of found its way, into my neocortex. I couldn't escape it.
Do you remember the ones where you just went, I didn't know you could do that? I didn't know language could do that?
One of the earliest ones, early primary school, The Highwayman.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah.
Oh my God, The Highwayman came riding. Like if you were just to break that down in terms of scansion, like it's an incredibly sophisticated and interesting use of, poetic feat. But the way in which the story sort of was carried and then compounded in its tension by the rhythm and the cadences of the repetitions, that was extraordinary to me. I still remember writing, I think I wrote, a total rip-off of it. I can't remember what it was, but it would have been something like the baker went baking or something like that. But, the rhythm just got into my blood.
What are your earliest memories of stories about Vietnam and Vietnamese identity?
They would have to be family stories. And of course, by the premise of the question, the earliest ones I wouldn't remember, but they would have sunk in there somehow and spread their roots. I guess part of this speaks to the question of silence. and there are different silences that might exist in immigrant families. A large one is the silence that exists between capacity for language. You know, I don't read or write Vietnamese. My parents, for quite some time, were way better than in English than I was in Vietnamese, but there was still a gap there. And we've never been able to have this kind of a conversation because we don't have the lexical, skill to actually sit in a commons of language and talk about these things and these ideas, and that is a real loss for me. So there is that silence. There's also the silence of trauma. There's the silence of willed forgetting, and there's the silence of just forgetting too. So it's hard for me to answer that without sort of digging into the ways in which whatever was said was couched within an auditorium of silence as well. And I guess I do remember stories about my parents' lives in Vietnam before, they had to leave. And the ones that really stuck with me, interestingly, so maybe I had a detector for this sort of early on, the stuff that was sort of fed to me as this is lore, L-O-R-E, it kind of just skated across the surface of my mind. But the little stray interstitial comments about the garage of the house in which they lived and to which, my mum's family was then directed after the house was confiscated, that's the stuff that sort of sticks with me as well. But I can't tell you, Michael, whether any of it's real because so much of it now is tied up in what I've written, thought, and said about it, and also what they, after the boat, came to me and said, oh, well, here's some other stories, or no, you got that wrong, this was the story. And so it's all sort of muddled up into, a big jumble for me, and I'm not really sure what's real.
It was something that you spoke about and wrote about very movingly in and around the boat, was that generational silence and that divide and that question of responsibility to stories owned by generations, not your own, and your parents in particular. Does this feel like a more personally exposing book for you because of the ways in which it directly claims and engages with those stories? Yeah,
it really does. It really does. Maybe not on a naked read, but yeah, I feel pretty flayed, putting this out there.
Probably a third of the poems in this collection take different forms of violence as a kind of framing device for the story that you're telling, the poem that you're sharing. And I want to ask how important violence is in your conception of poetry and language.
Oh, there's a lot of levels to how I think about violence, both in the way that it's used, linguistically, accusatorily, theoretically, and obviously one of the frequencies of violence, as you pointed out in the book, is sort of pointing the finger and sticking the tongue out at this notion that everything is violence. And violence, by its nature, or maybe by its conditioned nature, is just unquestionable. It's, you don't interrogate violence, kind of like you don't interrogate trauma. You just respect it. You just take it in, you absorb it, you accept it, and you respect it. And it kind of shuts down conversation, doesn't it? It shuts down discourse when you sort of say, I felt that as a violence. So part of what I'm trying to do, on one level, is bring a facetious sort of lens to that notion. And in some ways, this book is a taxonomizing and a delineation and a sort of like breaking open the classifications of violence. What do we mean when we say violence? There's a quote in the poem where sort of Heraclitus says all things take place by strife. And there are other sort of figures where when you think about anything that is generative at all, it is made by an intrinsic violence. When you think of cells dividing, mitosis, when you think about mitochondrial action within cells where things are sort of like violently transformed and converted into energy, which is then an exercise and exertion of violence itself. When you think about language, language is the primary site for and of violence. Like every single word that you read or see or say has a bloodied history of elision and misuse and theft and miscegenation behind it, and something I say in the Malouf book is, a dictionary is a site of massacre. So if you were to eschew violence, you would eschew life, you would eschew all things. And so part of the book is let's get into this.
And presumably, the point you're making about language, poetry as a site of violence. I mean, part of the tension in any poem is between form and disruption, and between reassurance and violence, if you like, if they're meaningful binaries. You know, how much when you go into writing a poem do you allow yourself to be taken off track, to be deliberately challenging the rhythm, the expectation, the tradition into which you're writing?
I would go so far as to say that that is the primary imperative of poetry in one way, because the other way is polish, is shellac, is frictionlessness, is, you know, exactly what you expect, exactly how you expect it, and is also ideology, piety, knowing exactly what you think and not needing to have to doubt or to put layers of contradiction or self-doubt or self-indictment on what you're doing. And for me, it's all about the other stuff. It's all about, you know, gouging into something to potentially kick off a new growth, a new healing, a new grafting. One thing that I've been thinking about is how a thing happens when someone reads something. And now more than ever, I think of that thing, that process, that phenomenon as being a really intimate one between the work and the reader, and through the work, the writer, of course. But it really is a one-on-one sort of thing. And so much of what makes us human goes into how we read, you know, that thing. And it's almost it's a date between two minds, in a sense. And as you know, you can go on dates with certain sort of biases or attitudes, and it can totally inflect or cruel the date. And it's the same thing with reading. And so I think in terms of disruption, violence, there is a pleasure in formula. There is a pleasure in sort of not knowing exactly what you're getting and knowing exactly how to feel. But there are places that you turn to sort of be provoked and challenged and feel discomforted in different ways. And I think that poetry, which is arguably the most intense iteration of language, that's the perfect place to be doing that.
In the 30-second poem, Intradiasporic, there is a footnote that says, the need to deflect via humour qua coping mechanism is a violence. That idea about deflection versus honest reckoning runs all the way through this book of poetry.
Yeah.
What it is to look directly at a thing and what it is to try and push past it.
Yeah.
How much is that intrinsically at the heart of the kind of migrant story it's telling and the kind of colonial, post-colonial story it's telling?
So one thing I would say at first is that the tonality of that particular footnote is meant to be one that is changeable and protean and slippery. There is sometimes a somewhat dulledly insistence that looking at something straight on is the truthful way of doing things, and we forget that way of doing things, of looking at something, and what invariably sort of emerges as the message from that looking are often pretty conditioned by ideologies that maybe we don't think about in those moments. So on one side of the spectrum, you get just maudlin sentimentality. You get the hallmark sort of cliches, which also happen to be among the most profound, aphorisms known to humankind. And then on the other hand, you get this notion that, I'm doing the unflinching, difficult thing of telling you that, for example, immigrants don't belong anywhere, and that exile is hard, and that unbelonging is the deepest wound, the deepest deracination that anyone can sort of feel. And these are true things, but they don't come anywhere close to me, for me, and for most of the, let's say, immigrant writers or diasporic writers that I know. Like, I think it's a lot more complicated, simultaneous. It's not a single voice that we have, and it's not a single message. It's a cacophony. It's a parliament of arguing, dissenting juvenile voices in our head that are sort of primed by taunts from childhood bullying to the most abstruse theoretical reading that we've done in our most recent, cultural linguistic classes. Like, it's all of these things, and it clashes and plays strife with everything else that constitutes that parliament, all of the constituencies of that parliament. And for me, that's one of the reasons why the book, in a sense, is one massive ongoing deflection, destabilization, undercutting overlaying. There's no single truth, because that notion of a single truth is kind of what got us into this mess in the first place.
When we return, Nam reveals how his new collection of poetry picks up on ideas that he began exploring way back in 2008. We'll be back in a sec. The first story in the boat, Love and Honour and Pity and Pride and Compassion and Sacrifice, and yes, I did read that title because I never remember it. The 25-year-old writer at the heart of that story, Nam, at Iowa Writers Workshop, would that Nam have written a book like 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem?
I mean, on one level, absolutely. On one level, I think this book is a direct continuation of the quest that was sort of first expressed in that story, of trying to find a way of telling one's truth without feeling like one is compromising oneself, or at least trying to be as truthful about the conditions of truth-telling as possible. It sounds really dry when I say it that way, but I feel like all serious art, as a pretty first principle thing, deals with the conditions of its making, and I think that's what makes serious art almost by definition radical or revolutionary, depending on how you want to pitch those terms, because they are sort of going back to a sense of, let's clear away all of these concessions that we have. Let's clear away all these presumptions and understandings and conventions, and actually sort of be honest about, what it is in this situation for an ethnic writer to write an ethnic story in English to a Western audience circa 2000 and whatever you want to call it.
There are moments in The Boat as a collection that, and not least in that first story, where, that book could have been called 7 Ways of Avoiding Writing a Vietnamese Story. That ambivalence is too strong a word, but that kind of tension around how to tell a Vietnamese story and whether that was what you wanted to do as a writer with your debut book, whether that was something you wanted to resist, whether the creative writing teacher in that first story is very focused on the idea that ethnic stories will do well. And there's a kind of anger and tension about that in that book.
Yeah.
Do you feel more reconciled about those ideas now? Do you think the culture is more reconciled about those ideas now? Or do you think it's a tension that continues to be useful, but you approach it differently?
Yeah, no, good question. I'm stunned by how live these concerns and questions are 15, 20 years on. I feel like at the time, those questions were still being put. They were happening, a few layers removed from the mainstream. Of course, the infrastructure was all different then. But they were still understood to be dangerous in a certain way. And as you know, like anytime you have something which is understood to be the case in private among trusted peers, and that is not at all reflected in the public discourse about that particular thing, there is scope for an agitation which can turn into a tension, which can turn into a whole maelstrom of bad faith and energy, which can be dangerous, And so that's obviously very interesting to me as a writer. It's pretty damaging to people who are caught in that vortex. And I don't think it's pushing it to say that those questions are in some ways even more enlivened and more sort of barbed now than they ever were.
I think there's something to that idea of the damage or the danger of bad faith as well in the role of the poet or the writer more generally in terms of authenticity of intention. How much internal integrity is there to the work? What is the thing that you're trying to do or say? And I think bad faith or insincerity is the enemy of good creative.
Yeah, I agree
products.
with you. Yeah, I think that's, in a way, that's the nutshell within which this book bounces around, right? Like there are poems that sort of interrogate notions of sincerity and of authenticity. Whenever I think of authenticity, which was for a long time the primary paradigm in which ethnic fiction, let's say, or ethnic writing was judged and valorized. I can't get away from the connotations of this is authentically something because like a food, or this is an authentic Nike pair of sneakers or whatever, which has on its flip side this notion that it's something that could be faked or forged, that's fraudulent. Immediately you're dealing in a world of commerce, branding, advertising in a sense. And you're also dealing in a terrain of suspicion. Like, is this authentic? Who gets to decide how authentic this is? Which is problematic enough without overlaying capital onto it, economic, social, political, cultural capital. And so I think the discourse has moved beyond that in a really healthy way, maybe not in the mainstream. But I also think that in some ways, the very dumb impulse that I had in the boat of don't tell me what to do, don't tell me what to think, don't tell me what to write, don't tell me what I'm thinking or saying or writing, even if I've written it, because there are valencies and layerings there. I think that is still very much on a superficial level. That's still very much the drive for me. It's always all elbows out, carving space all the time, because that's what we've got to do.
How does that change then when you have the kind of success you had with the boat? That as someone who I think I agree with your self-diagnosis there, you've got that kind of desire to push back and to confound, and suddenly you have this massive audience, you have this massive critical response, by any measure, critical, commercial, huge success with your debut. Does that make creativity after that hard because you're not just shadowboxing imagined audiences, you've got a real audience there that you're having to respond to?
One of the things that I ask of my work is that it can speak across a broad spectrum, so that if this is your nerdy want, you can sort of go in and you can dig for the illusions, and you can dig for the arguments or the contentions that have sort of been staged before that this is trying to restage or reprism. But I also want it to work on the other side of things, on like that gut punch, visceral, rhythmic level as well. I want it to be able to sort of be apprehensible to the reader that may not have a tertiary degree and a lot of time. And I want to do it without condescension. Like, I don't want it to be, well, if you only get it on that level, then there's something lesser about your read. And so that's hard, as you might imagine. Like, I want to be able to sort of stand by the work and its semiotics on all those different frequencies. At the same time, wanting to preserve as much openness and ambiguity and magic and mystery about the work, because that's the whole point of poetry, especially. The
challenge for poetry, though, is that it can be read as, it can be perceived as an exclusive club.
Yeah, totally.
The anxiety of the reader approaching a poem is different to the anxiety approaching a story or a work of prose.
Yep.
In that, I think often readers will approach a poem or a book of poetry as a problem that they have to solve, and if they don't get it, they've failed somehow.
Yeah, that's spot on. And you know what I would say is, if I had a dream for this book, and this goes back to your last question too, if I had a dream for this book, it would be to really stage to the reader that meaning is a process and it's never resolved. So what I would love, like, and I've had early readers come up to me and say, I thought I got the tone of the book. I thought I sort of understood what it was doing. And then I would come across this line or this poem and it would make me feel, oh, hang on, maybe that wasn't right. It might even make me feel uncomfortable with my earlier conclusions. And it would unsettle me. And then I would sort of come to an understanding of, oh, maybe it's not that, it's this, or maybe it's both at the same time. And to me, that's ambrosia to my soul, because I'm just thinking that's exactly what I want. I want to stage a notion of reading and of work as being a voyage or a process. And it's not, as you say, about, do you understand this reference from Seneca, that was then quoted in the epigraph to this T.S. Eliot poem. That's done both seriously and with full absurd facetiousness as well. I would love the poem to be able to just be a field of energy in which different readers can sort of find different things. But to go back to your earlier question, one of the things that did sort of just mess with my brain a bit after the boat was that no matter how carefully you stage an argument or an antinomy, like maybe two mutually exclusive arguments in the same sort of space, no matter how much you sort of cry, don't cage me in this sense or that sense. That inertial impulse is so strong that readers often do, and not just readers. My first proposed cover for the paperback in the States was of this Shanghai junk, floating through a hazy sort of Halong Bay. And I thought, did you read this book? Did you? And these are the professionals that were tasked with, protecting and promulgating what I was trying to do. So I didn't blame them for that, because of course they were sort of also subject to the imperatives of other things, the market, book clubs, graphic designers, etc. But I had to sort of arrive at a place, Michael, where I was not feeling agitated by readers, because readers are a gift, even if the readers were sort of instrumentalizing or taking certain things from their read, which were kind of not in line with what I was trying to do in the book. So I really had to come to a place of grace, I guess, with the notion that the book is its own thing and it lives its own life and it makes its own weird friends out there.
But there is, even embedded in the title, 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem, a kind of tongue-in-cheek suggestion that you are steering your reader more firmly, guiding them by the hand with this book, that there are conclusions they might reach if they trust you.
Yeah, I think so. And abandon all hope, or ye who enter, I guess I would say to that.
And the nature of 36 ways rather than 36 steps is about divergent paths and parallel paths rather than choices, or rather than linear storytelling.
Yeah, it's not A to B, it's simultaneous. So here are 36 and counting ways, and of course the word ways has such a strong resonance in so many different traditions. They're not done, they're inviting you to come along and have a go.
Namley's first collection of poetry, 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem, is out now. Before we go, I wanted to let you know what I've been reading this week, and you might recall that I am a sucker for a good crime novel, and one novelist who I'm always excited to read a new book by is Dervla McTiernan. Her new novel is called What Happened to Nina? The answer to that question and what the book's about are all surprises, so I'm going to leave you to find it and enjoy it yourself. You can find all of Dervla's books, Nam's books, and any other book we mentioned at your favourite independent bookstore. That's it for this week's show. If you enjoyed it, tell your friends, rate and review us. Read This is produced and edited by Clara Ames. Mixing and original composition by Zoltan Fetcher. Thanks for listening. See you next week.